Elara Thorne, 32, had sought Auldhaven for its emptiness. She sought the kind of quiet that allowed a person to hear their own thoughts, or, ideally, to drown them out entirely. She arrived in the village, a huddle of grey stone and slate clinging desperately to the rugged North Sea coast, in the dead of late autumn. The wind, a character unto itself, was a relentless, cold antagonist, scraping salt and grit across every surface, including her newly acquired primary school classroom. Auldhaven Primary had only 22 pupils. Elara taught them all, from the nervous 5-year-olds learning their phonics to the world-weary 10-year-olds who looked at her with the deep, unsettling wisdom that comes from growing up close to the wilderness and the unforgiving sea. Her existence was meticulously ordered. Lesson plans, grading, a solitary supper of lentil soup by the sputtering peat fire in her rented cottage, and the constant low-level thrum of being observed. The village's surveillance was not malicious, merely habitual. Auldhaven was a place where generations were knitted together like a fisherman's net, and any new thread was examined, poked, and judged for its fitness. Elara, the English townie with the gentle manners and the slightly melancholy eyes, was an anomaly. Her carefully constructed solitude shattered with the arrival of Hamish MacLeod at the first parent-teacher consultation evening. Hamish was a man forged by the same forces that shaped the craggy coastline. He was immense in stature, not merely tall, but broad, with the heavy, purposeful shoulders of someone who worked hard outdoors. His hair, dark and perpetually wind-tousled, was threaded with silver, like the sea foam catching the moonlight. He carried the scent of cold wool, diesel and salt. He was the father of Fiona, a quiet, preternaturally observant 7-year-old in Elara's second-grade cluster. Elara was discussing Fiona's remarkable grasp of history, tempered by her difficulty in participating in group activities. Hamish sat opposite her, dwarfing the small wooden chair, his green eyes, the colour of deep coastal water, fixed on Elara, not on the papers. "Fiona is quiet," Hamish rumbled, his voice low, a sound that seemed meant for the open air, not the confines of the stuffy classroom. "But she doesn't miss a thing. She says you have a kindness about you, Miss Thorne, that the last teacher lacked." "That's very sweet of her, Mr. MacLeod." Elara felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. She had spent a year perfecting the art of being invisible, and this man was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the room. "Hamish," he corrected, a slight, almost imperceptible curve of his firm mouth. "And kindness is worth more than all the academic accolades in Edinburgh." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the sterile boundary between teacher and parent dissolved. There was an unspoken, instantaneous recognition, two lonely souls moored in a small harbour, finally seeing a light on the other side. The initial steps of their courtship were agonizingly slow, conducted in fragments of time and hushed tones. They began with legitimate excuses, discussing Fiona's weekend projects, borrowing a specific history book, dropping off forgotten lunchboxes. These interactions became longer, edging toward flirtation that was always instantly recalled and shielded by a layer of polite formality. Their first secret meeting took place not in the village but miles out, on the ancient coastal path that wound around the cliffs to the abandoned Suta lighthouse. Elara found him waiting, his silhouette sharp against the fading amber light of a winter sunset. "I didn't think you'd come," he admitted, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his heavy coat. "I told Agnes at the post office I was going bird-watching," Elara confessed, a nervous giggle escaping her. "She looked at me as if I'd admitted to shoplifting." They walked for hours, talking about everything but the village. Hamish spoke of the relentless cycles of the sea, the weight of being a single father after his wife's passing 3 years prior, and the quiet fear that Fiona would always feel the loss. Elara, in turn, hesitantly shared the reason for her flight from the city, a broken engagement and the slow, humiliating decay of a life she thought she wanted. "You've got grit, Elara," Hamish said softly, stopping to look back at the lights of Auldhaven twinkling far below, appearing small and inconsequential from their vantage point. "To start over here, where the land and the people test you every day." He reached out and his large, calloused thumb gently traced the sharp line of her jaw. It was a simple, non-erotic touch, but it ignited a fire in Elara that had been banked for years. The physical tension between them, fueled by their shared loneliness and the constant necessity of restraint, became a palpable, living thing. The whisper and the wind. The villagers were not blind. They were merely waiting for the evidence to align with their suspicions. Agnes MacIntyre, a woman whose eyes missed nothing, had noted the subtle changes. Hamish MacLeod, who usually wore practical fisherman's sweaters, was suddenly presenting himself in clean, starched shirts. Elara, who had always kept her car spotless, now often had a fine sheen of dried mud on the wheel wells, the kind of mud found only on the track to Hamish's remote croft. The rumours began to bite. Morag, Hamish's distant cousin and the self-appointed guardian of MacLeod honour, took to speaking loudly in the village tea-room. "It's a disgrace is what it is. That man is grieving, and that woman is preying on him, and in front of his wee girl, too, using school time for her little fancy." The direct impact hit Elara in her profession. Parents became cool, their smiles freezing around the edges. Mrs. Duncan, whose son Robbie had always adored Elara, pulled him out of the after-school reading club. "Just too many distractions, Miss Thorne. I prefer Robbie to focus on his work, not on the village gossip," she said, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive judgment. Elara felt the walls closing in. She confessed her distress to Hamish during one of their brief stolen moments in his drafty peat shed behind the croft. The air was heavy with the rich, smoky scent of the fuel. "I can't do this, Hamish. They're hurting the children to get at me. I'll have to leave. I can't stay here and be the subject of their constant scrutiny." Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. Hamish's expression hardened. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "Elara, you didn't run from the city to hide here. You came here to build something new, and I'm building something with you. We don't run from the whispers. We stand against them. Let them talk. They'll tire of it once they see we're not going anywhere." He kissed her then, a fierce, desperate kiss of loyalty and protection. The setting was rough, peat dust on their coats, the cold air seeping into the shed, but the need was incandescent. The breaking point, a moment of necessary release. The pressure became unbearable. The longing, the secrecy, the shared glances, and the fear of exposure created a constant aching tension between them. It reached a devastating peak one night, after Hamish had successfully navigated a difficult day, defending Elara against Morag's insinuation at the local pub. He came straight to her cottage, knocking sharply, the urgency in his fist matching the raw need in his eyes. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside. Shedding his oilskin coat onto the stone floor, his clothes damp and smelling faintly of the sea. Elara had been sitting by the fire, reading. She rose slowly, dropping the book, the thud of its landing loud in the small room. She saw the strain in his face, the exhaustion of fighting the world for her, for them. "They are savages, Hamish," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," he contradicted, his voice raspy. "They're just scared. Scared of anything new, scared of losing their traditions, and scared of the truth." He moved towards her, slowly, deliberately. The firelight flickered, throwing dancing shadows across the heavy beams of the low ceiling. He reached out and cupped her face, his hands wonderfully warm against her cool skin. "The truth is, Elara," he breathed, his forehead touching hers, "I can't spend another hour of my life pretending you don't exist for me, pretending I don't think about you when I'm out on the boat, when I'm sitting alone, when Fiona asks me about homework." He kissed her, a deep, consuming kiss that expressed months of suppressed desire. It wasn't the tentative, exploratory kiss of their first meeting. This was the kiss of two people demanding to be seen, to be touched, to be whole. Hamish's hands left her face, moving down her neck under the heavy wool of her cardigan. His fingers found the sensitive skin beneath the lace collar of her blouse. She gasped, a low, shaky sound, and pressed herself against the solid, immovable wall of his chest. The eroticism was not in spectacle, but in the profound intimacy of their vulnerability. He lifted her easily, without breaking the connection, and carried her the few steps to the old leather sofa nestled by the fire. The rough texture of his trousers against her legs, the sudden shift in gravity. It all heightened the sensory intensity. He paused, leaning back to look at her, his eyes dark, reflecting the fire. Elara, I need you to tell me now if you want this. I want you, Hamish, she managed, her breath catching in her throat. I want all of you, away from the eyes, away from the cold. He smiled then, a heart-stopping, relieved smile, and lowered his head, pressing a trail of hot, seeking kisses down the exposed column of her throat, sending shivers across her skin. His movements, though powerful, were imbued with a reverence that she found devastatingly tender. He took his time, savoring the moment, removing the restrictive layers of clothing that represented the propriety they had both worn as armor for so long. The fire roared, the wind howled outside, and in that cottage, finally, they found a sanctuary from the world, a deep, necessary fusion of bodies and souls, a connection that was both fiercely physical and utterly grounding, proving that their love was a real, tangible force capable of silencing the external noise. The confrontation at the lighthouse. The next morning, they made a decision. No more secrecy. The price of discretion had become too high. It was time to face the music. The final climactic confrontation occurred not at the Harvest Fair, but during the annual Auldhaven Heritage Day, a stuffy, formal event held inside the village hall, where the community's judgment was most concentrated. Elara walked in on Hamish's arm. She wore a simple, elegant dress that spoke of quiet confidence. Hamish, in a clean, dark suit he wore awkwardly but with determination, held his head high. The entire hall, mostly filled with stiff-backed elders and whispering mothers, fell into an immediate, heavy silence. Agnes MacIntyre, her face flushed with righteous indignation, marched directly up to them. This is an insult to the memory of Hamish's late wife, and it's a failure of your duty, Miss Thorne. You cannot teach our children about virtue when you yourself live in sin. The word hung in the air like a stone. Elara gripped Hamish's arm, her composure wavering. Hamish, however, was rock solid. He looked at Agnes, and then slowly surveyed the room, his gaze resting on Morag, on Mrs. Duncan, and finally on the provost, old Mr. Campbell. Agnes, Hamish's voice was calm but carried the immense weight of a life spent weathering real storms. The virtue I teach my daughter is honesty, kindness, and strength. Elara is the kindest, most honest woman I have ever known, and I love her. I intend to marry her. We have told Fiona, and she is happy. The only sin here is the cruelty of judging a good woman who has brought light back into my life and mine, and a much-needed stability to this school. He paused, lowering his voice slightly, but still audible across the stunned silence. My love for my late wife is a part of me, a part of Fiona, and she would be glad that I am happy. It is not for you to decide what is proper grief or proper love for me. It is only for you to decide if you want to lose the best teacher this school has hired by chasing her away with your incessant, bitter gossip. He turned to Elara, his green eyes sparkling with protective fire, and publicly, openly kissed her. A soft, possessive kiss that was a final, undeniable statement of ownership and commitment. The happy ending. The mending of the net. Hamish's public declaration was the shock Auldhaven needed. They hadn't expected the quiet fisherman-farmer to fight back so fiercely, and they hadn't expected the gentle teacher to stand her ground. The initial backlash was sharp, but slowly the village began to adjust. They saw Hamish and Elara working side by side, planting flowers outside the school, mending the roof of the Croft cottage they were renovating, and most tellingly, laughing easily in the village shop. They saw the happiness reflected in Fiona's usually reserved eyes. Elara taught the children resilience and the power of forgiveness. Hamish taught Elara to fish and to mend nets, integrating her into the practical rhythms of his life. The turning point was during a ferocious storm in January. The power went out across the village. Hamish, a seasoned hand, went out immediately to help restore power lines. Elara, without being asked, went to the school, built a massive peat fire in the old stove, and set up a temporary soup kitchen, providing warmth and comfort to the shivering elders and scared children. When Hamish finally returned hours later, covered in ice and exhausted, he found Elara serving Agnes MacIntyre, whose face was pale with cold, a steaming mug of hot chocolate. The next day, Agnes stopped Elara outside the post office. She didn't apologize, because an Auldhaven resident rarely gave ground. Instead, she merely thrust a heavy, hand-knitted woolen scarf into Elara's hands. "That wind," Agnes muttered, refusing to meet Elara's eye. "It gets right through the bone. You'll be needing this." It was the Auldhaven equivalent of a blessing. A year later, they married in the small stone kirk, overlooking the churning sea. It was a simple, noisy affair, with half the village turning out. Elara wore white, and Fiona was her proud, beaming flower girl. They moved into the newly renovated croft, overlooking the cliffs and the Souter lighthouse. Their life wasn't always peaceful. The wind still howled, Hamish was still ruggedly reserved, and Elara still had to fight for her classroom budget. But it was their life, built on shared strength, and a love that had proven itself stronger than the fiercest gossip. Years later, on a perfect summer evening, they sat on the steps of their porch, watching the sun dip below the western moorland. Fiona, now a teenager, was off with friends. Elara leaned her head against Hamish's shoulder, the rough wool of his sweater a familiar comfort. "Do you ever think about the city?" Hamish asked, his voice soft. Elara paused, inhaling the scent of heather and sea air. "Never. The city was quiet, but it was lonely. Auldhaven is loud, full of opinions and wind, but it's real. And you," she turned her head and kissed the stubble on his cheek, "you make it home." He wrapped his strong arm around her and pulled her close, his lips finding hers, their kiss a promise kept, a quiet, enduring defiance against the constant, restless rhythm of the North Sea.